The thunder rolled across the open plains like a prophecy as Grace Fairchild stepped from the stagecoach into the muddy street of Cherry Creek, Colorado. The year was 1875, and with nothing but a carpetbag containing her worldly possessions and her father's pocket watch, she faced the untamed frontier with a determination that belied her 22 years. Her arrival in this dusty mining town wasn't by choice. It was her last resort after her family's fortune had crumbled in Boston following her father's untimely death. The rain-soaked streets of Cherry Creek showed little promise as she made her way toward the town's only hotel, mud clinging to the hem of her once fine traveling dress. The settlement had sprung up around the silver mines that dotted the surrounding mountains, drawing fortune seekers, outlaws, and desperate souls alike. Grace counted herself among the latter, though she'd sooner die than admit it. "Madam, you might want to watch your step there," a deep voice called out just as Grace's boots slipped on the slick boardwalk. A strong hand caught her elbow, steadying her before she could fall face first into the mud. She looked up to thank her rescuer, and found herself staring into eyes as blue as a summer sky, set in a sun-weathered face partially hidden by the brim of a well-worn Stetson. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders that spoke of a life of hard physical labor. "Thank you, sir," Grace said, quickly regaining her composure and extracting her arm from his grip. "Zeke Calloway," he introduced himself with a slight tip of his hat, "and you're clearly new to Cherry Creek." "Is it that obvious?" Grace attempted a smile, though her exhaustion made it difficult. "Folk around here don't usually dress so fine even when they're mud-splattered." His eyes held an amused glint. "Where are you headed?" "The hotel, if there is one worthy of the name in this place." Zeke's mouth quirked into a half-smile. "The silver spur's decent enough." "I'll walk you there. Streets can be treacherous when they're like this." Grace hesitated. In Boston, she would never have accepted an escort from a stranger, but this wasn't Boston. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "The West has its own rules, Gracie. Different, not lesser." "Very well, Mr. Calloway, I would appreciate that." As they walked, Grace noticed the curious glances from townsfolk. Women in particular seemed interested in their progress, some whispering behind gloved hands. "You're something of a local celebrity, it seems," Grace observed. "Not me," Zeke replied, guiding her around a particularly deep puddle. "Just don't get many new faces in Cherry Creek, especially not ladies traveling alone." The hotel, when they reached it, was a 2-story wooden structure with peeling paint and windows that had seen better days. Still, it looked clean enough, and Grace was too tired to be particular. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Calloway." "Zeke," he corrected. "Nobody calls me Mr. Calloway except the bank manager when he's trying to convince me to sell my ranch." "You own a ranch?" Grace asked, her interest piqued despite her fatigue. "The Double C, about 5 miles west of town, not the biggest spread, but it's mine." There was unmistakable pride in his voice. "What brings you to Cherry Creek, miss?" "Fairchild, Grace Fairchild." She hesitated, reluctant to reveal too much to a stranger, no matter how helpful. "I'm here to take a position. Teaching at the schoolhouse?" "No, I'm to be the new manager at Harrington's Mercantile." Zeke's expression changed so suddenly that Grace took an instinctive step back. "Harrington's." "You're working for Victor Harrington?" "I am. Do you know him?" "Everybody knows Harrington," Zeke said, his tone now cold. "And I should warn you, Miss Fairchild, he's not a man to be trusted." Before Grace could respond, the hotel door opened, and a portly man in a suit too fine for the surroundings stepped out. His carefully waxed mustache twitched as he spotted them. "Miss Fairchild, I presume?" the man said, ignoring Zeke completely. "I'm Victor Harrington." "I've been waiting for your arrival." Grace felt Zeke stiffen beside her, but she extended her hand to her new employer. "Mr. Harrington, it's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." "I see you've met Calloway," Harrington said, his tone suggesting it was anything but fortunate. "Mr. Calloway kindly helped me navigate your rather muddy streets," Grace explained. Harrington's smile didn't reach his eyes. "How charitable of him. "Come inside, Miss Fairchild. I've arranged a room for you and we have much to discuss about your duties." Grace turned to thank Zeke once more, but his expression stopped her. The warmth she'd seen earlier had vanished, replaced by a cold intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Be careful who you trust in Cherry Creek, Miss Fairchild," Zeke said quietly, tipping his hat before turning away. Harrington's hand on her elbow was insistent as he guided her inside. "You would do well to avoid Calloway and his kind, Miss Fairchild. They're a dying breed in these parts and not everyone appreciates their resistance to progress." Grace glanced back through the hotel's grimy window to see Zeke mounting a magnificent chestnut stallion. There was something in his bearing, a quiet dignity that contradicted Harrington's dismissive words. She had come to Cherry Creek seeking a new beginning, not to become embroiled in local feuds. Yet as she watched Zeke Calloway ride away, she couldn't shake the feeling that their paths would cross again, and soon. The following morning, Grace rose before dawn, a habit ingrained from her childhood. Her father, a successful merchant before his investments failed, had always insisted that the early bird catches not just the worm, but the best opportunities. She dressed carefully in one of her simpler gowns, conscious that she needed to strike the right balance between respectability and practicality in her new role. Harrington's Mercantile occupied the largest building on Cherry Creek's Main Street. The two-story structure housed the store on the ground floor and Harrington's offices above. When Grace arrived, the store was already unlocked, though not yet open for business. Inside, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, stocked with everything from basic staples to luxury items one wouldn't expect to find in such a remote location. A young man was sweeping the floor, and he looked up in surprise when Grace entered. "Store don't open for another hour, madam," he said. "I'm Grace Fairchild, the new manager," she replied. "And you are?" "Tommy Wilson, miss. I help stock the shelves and make deliveries." He couldn't have been more than 16, with a shock of red hair and a liberal sprinkling of freckles across his face. "It's nice to meet you, Tommy. Is Mr. Harrington in yet?" "No, madam. Mr. Harrington don't usually come in till later. Said you'd be starting today, though." Grace set her small handbag on the counter and began to familiarize herself with the store's layout. She had worked in her father's business from a young age, learning accounting and inventory management alongside her formal education. When Harrington had advertised for a store manager, she had applied immediately, desperate to escape Boston and the pitying glances of former friends. By the time Harrington arrived, Grace had already reviewed the ledger books and found several discrepancies that concerned her. "Mr. Harrington," she said after they had exchanged pleasantries, "I've been looking over the accounts and I noticed that several local ranchers appear to be significantly in debt to the store." Harrington's smile was thin. "Yes, Miss Fairchild, many of our customers operate on credit. The cattle business can be unpredictable. But these balances are substantial, and there doesn't seem to be any payment plan in place." She pointed to one entry in particular. "The Double C Ranch, for instance. According to these figures, Mr. Calloway hasn't made a payment in 3 months. "You have a keen eye," Harrington said, taking the ledger from her hands and closing it firmly. "But you needn't concern yourself with the credit arrangements. I handle those personally." "With all due respect, sir, as manager," Harrington cut in, his tone sharp despite his smile, "your duties will be to oversee daily operations, inventory, and staffing. The financial arrangements with certain customers are my purview. Is that understood?" Grace wanted to argue but reminded herself of her precarious position. She needed this job. "Of course, Mr. Harrington, I apologize for overstepping." His expression softened slightly. "No need to apologize. You're eager to prove yourself, which I appreciate. Now, I believe we have customers waiting." Indeed, several women had gathered outside, peering curiously through the windows. Harrington unlocked the door with a flourish, and the day began in earnest. By midday, Grace was beginning to understand the social dynamics of Cherry Creek. The town was clearly divided between those who supported Harrington and his vision for expanding the mining operations, and those who sided with the ranchers who felt their way of life was being threatened. The women who came to shop were eager to share gossip, particularly with a newcomer who might be a fresh audience for old stories. "That Calloway's been nothing but trouble since he came back from the war," one woman confided as Grace measured out fabric for her. "Fighting the mine expansion every step of the way, like we don't all benefit from progress." "Is that so?" Grace replied neutrally, carefully folding the calico. "My husband says Harrington's offered him a fair price for that ranch a dozen times, but he's too stubborn to sell," another added. "Could be living comfortably in Denver or even back east, but no, he has to stand in the way of the whole town's future." The bell over the door jingled, and the women fell silent as Zeke Calloway himself walked in, accompanied by a tall man with silver-streaked dark hair whom Grace hadn't met. "Ladies," Zeke greeted them with a nod before approaching the counter. The women quickly finished their purchases and departed, throwing curious glances over their shoulders. "Mr. Calloway," Grace acknowledged him. "How may I help you today?" "Need some supplies," he said, handing her a list. "And this is Ben Taylor, foreman at the Double C." The older man tipped his hat. "Madam," Grace reviewed the list, mostly practical items like coffee, flour, and ammunition. "I'll have Tommy gather these for you. Will you be paying in cash or—" She trailed off, remembering the ledger entry. "Put it on my account," Zeke said, his expression challenging, as if daring her to mention the outstanding balance. "Of course." Grace turned to find Tommy, but the boy was already loading a crate with the requested items, clearly familiar with Zeke's usual order. Ben wandered off to examine a display of tools, leaving Zeke and Grace relatively alone at the counter. "How are you finding Cherry Creek, Miss Fairchild?" Zeke asked, his voice low enough that Ben couldn't hear. "It's different from what I'm accustomed to," Grace admitted. "Boston, right?" "I recognize the accent." Grace raised an eyebrow. "You've been to Boston. Before the war, my father had business there." His eyes, which had softened momentarily, hardened again. "I imagine Harrington's already filled your head with stories about me." "Mr. Harrington hasn't mentioned you at all," Grace lied, unsure why she felt the need to protect Zeke's feelings. "Then the ladies of Cherry Creek surely have." His smile was wry. "I can guess what they've told you, that I'm standing in the way of progress, that I'm too stubborn to know what's good for me." Grace busied herself with writing up his order. "It's not my place to listen to gossip, Mr. Calloway." "Zeke," he reminded her. "And you'd be wise to listen to all sides before you form an opinion about Cherry Creek and its conflicts." The storeroom door opened and Harrington emerged, his face darkening when he spotted Zeke. "Calloway, I wasn't aware we were still extending credit to the Double C." "My account's good, Harrington," Zeke said, straightening to his full height, which put him several inches taller than the merchant. "That's a matter of opinion. Miss Fairchild, please inform Mr. Calloway that we require payment on outstanding balances before extending further credit." Grace looked between the two men, tension crackling in the air between them like heat lightning. "Mr. Harrington, perhaps we could discuss this in private." "There's nothing to discuss. It's simple business." Ben had rejoined them, his hand resting casually near the pistol at his hip. The store had emptied of other customers, leaving the four of them in a tableau of barely contained hostility. "I'll pay what I owe when my cattle go to market next month," Zeke said, his voice dangerously calm. "Same as always." "Your cattle," Harrington scoffed. "Half your herd is mortgaged to my bank, Calloway, or have you forgotten that? I'm well aware of my obligations." Grace felt caught in the crossfire of a battle whose origins she didn't understand. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Harrington, as you said, credit arrangements are your purview. Perhaps in this instance, you're new here, Miss Fairchild." Harrington cut her off without taking his eyes off Zeke. "You don't understand the situation. Calloway and his kind are a relic of the past. This territory is growing, developing. The future is in mining, in commerce. Not in grazing cattle on land that could yield far greater riches." Not everyone measures riches the same way, Zeke replied quietly. Harrington's laugh was sharp. Poetic sentiments won't pay your debts, Calloway. You have until the end of the month to settle your account, or I'll have no choice but to call in the mortgage. For a moment, Grace thought Zeke might strike Harrington. His hands clenched into fists, and Ben shifted his stance slightly, ready to intervene if necessary. But then Zeke's shoulders relaxed, though his eyes remained cold. End of the month, he repeated. You'll have your money. Come on, Ben. The two men left without the supplies they'd come for, the bell over the door jangling discordantly in their wake. Harrington turned to Grace, his expression severe. Let that be a lesson, Miss Fairchild. In the West, a man's word is his bond. Calloway has been living on borrowed time and money for too long. His type, the cowboys, the ranchers, they're being replaced by a new order. Progress cannot be stopped, only delayed by stubborn fools. Grace nodded, though she felt a deep unease. There was something in Harrington's tone that suggested this was more than a business dispute, it was personal. And personal vendettas, her father had often said, made for poor business decisions. I understand, Mr. Harrington, she said, though in truth, she understood very little about the undercurrents running through Cherry Creek. But she intended to learn, and quickly. Later that afternoon, as Grace was closing up the store, Sheriff Howard Miller stopped by. He was a bulky man with a bushy mustache that seemed to be perpetually in need of trimming, and he wore his badge with an air of resignation rather than pride. Evening, Miss Fairchild, he greeted her. Thought I'd check in, see how you're settling in. Very well, thank you, Sheriff, Grace replied, fastening the lock on the cash register. Is there something I can help you with, just being neighborly? He glanced around the empty store, heard there was a bit of a disagreement with Zeke Calloway earlier. News traveled fast in Cherry Creek, it seemed. A minor business matter, Mr. Harrington handled it. The sheriff nodded slowly. Harrington handles a lot of things in this town, owns the bank this store, has interests in most of the mines. He paused. Just so you know, Calloway's not a bad sort. Hot-headed sometimes, but honest. Grace studied the sheriff's face, trying to discern his loyalties. You sound as though you know him well. Known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. His daddy was one of the first to settle this valley before the silver strike brought the rush. Zeke grew up here, went off to fight for the Union, came back changed like most who survived that hell. The sheriff absently twisted his wedding ring. Lost his wife and child while he was away. Fever took them both in '63. The casual revelation of such personal tragedy took Grace aback. I didn't know. No reason you should, the sheriff shrugged. Just thought you might want to know there's more to folks around here than what you might hear from Harrington and his circle. With that cryptic comment, he bid her good night and left, leaving Grace with more questions than answers about the divided loyalties of Cherry Creek. The following week passed in a blur of activity as Grace settled into her role at the Mercantile. She discovered that, despite Harrington's controlling nature, he was often absent, attending to his various business interests in Denver and beyond. This gave her considerable freedom to manage the store as she saw fit, and she quickly implemented systems to improve efficiency and record-keeping. She also began to form her own impressions of the townsfolk. Cherry Creek, she learned, had grown rapidly after silver was discovered in the nearby mountains in 1868. What had once been a small settlement of ranchers and farmers had transformed into a bustling mining town almost overnight. The sudden wealth had created sharp divisions between the original settlers and the newcomers, between those who worked the land and those who sought to extract its mineral riches. Victor Harrington had arrived in 1869 with capital from Eastern investors and had quickly established himself as a central figure in the town's development. He had bought the general store, founded the bank, and acquired interests in several mines. His vision for Cherry Creek was ambitious, a modern city to rival Denver, with a railway connection that would bring even more growth and prosperity. It was this vision that put him at odds with ranchers like Zeke Calloway, who valued the open spaces and traditional way of life that was being steadily encroached upon by Harrington's expansion plans. Grace found herself caught between these competing perspectives, sympathetic to both the desire for progress and the wish to preserve what was being lost in its pursuit. She had seen similar transitions in the East, where industrialization had brought both opportunities and costs. On her day off, she decided to explore beyond the town limits, hiring a gentle mare from the livery stable. The owner, a grizzled old-timer named Hank, seemed amused by her request. "Don't see many ladies riding out alone," he commented as he helped adjust her stirrups. "I assure you I'm quite capable," Grace replied, gathering the reins. She had learned to ride as a child during summer visits to her grandfather's country estate. "Never said you weren't, miss. Just be mindful of where you wander. Some folks don't take kindly to trespassers." With that warning in mind, Grace set out, following the main road westward out of town. The late summer landscape was breathtaking, rolling hills giving way to rugged mountains, with the clear blue sky stretching endlessly overhead. After the confinement of Boston's narrow streets and the constant bustle of the mercantile, the open space was intoxicating. She had ridden for about an hour when she spotted a lone rider approaching from the direction of a distant ranch house. As the figure drew closer, she recognized the broad shoulders and distinctive Stetson of Zeke Calloway. He reined in his chestnut stallion as they met on the road, surprise evident in his expression. "Miss Fairchild, this is unexpected." "Mr. Calloway," she acknowledged him. "I had a free day and thought I'd explore the countryside. Alone." There was concern in his voice rather than judgment. "I'm perfectly safe, I assure you." She gestured to the small derringer tucked in her belt, a parting gift from her father, "and quite capable of finding my way back to town." Zeke's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I don't doubt your capabilities, Miss Fairchild, but these hills can be deceptive. Easy to lose your bearings if you're not familiar with them." As if to emphasize his point, dark clouds began to gather over the mountains to the west, the distant rumble of thunder carrying on the wind. "Perhaps I should turn back," Grace conceded, glancing at the approaching storm. "You won't make it before that hits," Zeke said, assessing the distance and the speed of the gathering clouds with the practiced eye of someone who lived by the whims of the weather. "The double C is closer. You'd be welcome to wait out the storm there." Grace hesitated, weighing the propriety of accepting such an invitation against the practical reality of being caught in what looked to be a significant downpour. "I wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition. Ben's wife, Martha, is at the house." "You'll have proper chaperonage if that's your concern." There was a hint of amusement in his tone that suggested he found such Eastern sensibilities quaint in the context of frontier practicalities. Another crack of thunder, closer this time, made the decision for her. "Lead the way, Mr. Calloway." They set off at a brisk trot, veering from the main road onto a well-worn trail that led toward a cluster of buildings nestled against the backdrop of pine-covered hills. The Double C Ranch was modest compared to some of the sprawling cattle operations Grace had read about, but it had a settled, permanent feel to it that spoke of generations rather than opportunistic development. The main house was a substantial log structure with a wide porch and glass windows, luxuries in this part of the country. Several outbuildings, including a barn, bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a smithy, formed a rough square around a central yard. A corral held several horses, and in the distance, Grace could make out the shapes of cattle grazing on the hillsides. They had just reached the barn when the skies opened. Zeke helped Grace dismount, then led both horses inside as rain pounded against the roof with startling ferocity. "Western storms don't waste time with preliminaries," he commented, moving efficiently to unsaddle the horses. Grace, feeling awkward standing idle, moved to help with her mare. "May I assist?" Zeke looked surprised but nodded. "Sure, you know your way around horses then." "My grandfather kept several at his estate outside Boston. I spent summers there as a child." She worked alongside him, removing the saddle and beginning to brush down the mare's rain-dampened coat. "This is a beautiful ranch, Mr. Calloway." "Zeke," he corrected her for what felt like the dozenth time. "And thank you, been in my family for nearly 30 years. My father built that house with his own hands when he brought my mother out from St. Louis. You've lived here your whole life, except for during the war." His tone made it clear that was a subject he preferred not to elaborate on. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, the rain creating a soothing rhythm on the barn roof. When the horses were settled, Zeke led Grace through the downpour to the main house, both of them arriving on the porch somewhat drenched despite the short distance. The door opened before Zeke could reach for it, and a plump, motherly woman with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun stood there, hands on her hips. "Ezekiel Calloway, you're tracking mud all over my clean porch," she scolded, though there was affection behind the stern words. "Martha, this is Miss Grace Fairchild from town," Zeke said, ignoring the reprimand. "Miss Fairchild, Martha Taylor, Ben's wife and the closest thing to civilization we have out here." Martha's expression softened as she took in Grace's bedraggled appearance. "Goodness, child, you're soaked through. Come in, come in. I'll find you something dry to wear while those clothes are seen to." Before Grace could protest, she was ushered inside and toward a back bedroom, leaving Zeke dripping in the entryway. The interior of the Calloway home was surprisingly refined given its frontier location. The furniture was solid and well-crafted, with touches of elegance in the form of framed paintings and shelves of books that lined one wall of the main room. A large stone fireplace dominated the space, with comfortable-looking chairs arranged around it. Martha provided Grace with a simple but clean calico dress that was only slightly too large. "Ben's niece left this last time she visited," she explained. "Should fit well enough until your things dry." When Grace emerged, she found Zeke by the fire, having also changed into dry clothing. He rose when she entered, and for a moment, neither spoke. There was something disconcertingly intimate about being in his home, wearing borrowed clothes with the storm raging outside. "Miss Fairchild," he finally said, "I hope you're comfortable." "Quite, thank you." She took the seat he offered. "You have a lovely home, Mr. Zeke." His smile at her use of his given name was genuine. "It's not grand, but it serves its purpose. I think it's charming. And your library is impressive for such a remote location." My mother's influence. She was a schoolteacher before she married my father, insisted that living on the frontier was no excuse for intellectual neglect. He ran a hand along the spines of the books. "She taught me to read by lamplight after long days of ranch work. She sounds remarkable." She was. A shadow crossed his face. "Both my parents passed some years ago, influenza." "I'm sorry for your loss," Grace said softly. "My father died last year. It's difficult." Zeke studied her for a moment as if seeing her properly for the first time. "Is that why you came west? A fresh start?" Grace nodded, surprised by his perception. "My father's business failed before his death. There was talk of scandal, though nothing was ever proven. Boston society has a long memory for such things. And a short supply of forgiveness," Zeke added, precisely. Grace found herself relaxing in his presence, the usual guard she maintained with others slipping away. "When I saw Mr. Harrington's advertisement for a store manager, it seemed providential. A chance to use my skills far from prying eyes and whispered judgments. And how do you find Cherry Creek compared to Boston? Different in every conceivable way," Grace laughed. "But not unpleasantly so. There's a directness here that's refreshing after the layers of politis back east." Martha bustled in with a tray of coffee and freshly baked corn bread, interrupting their conversation. "You two must be famished. Storm's looking to settle in for a while, so you might as well eat while you wait." The three of them shared a simple but satisfying meal, with Martha keeping the conversation flowing with questions about Grace's background and tales of life on the ranch. Ben joined them later, bringing news that all the stock was secure despite the worsening weather. "Road to town'll be washed out by now," he commented, accepting a cup of coffee from his wife. "You'd best plan on staying the night, Miss Fairchild." Grace glanced at Zeke, who nodded confirmation. "Ben's right. The creek that gives the town its name runs between here and there. It floods with storms like this." "I couldn't impose," Grace began, but Martha cut her off. "Nonsense, child. We've plenty of room, and it's no imposition to offer shelter from a storm. It's the way things are done out here." The matter settled, they passed the evening in conversation. Grace found herself drawn to Zeke's quiet intelligence and thoughtful perspective on the changes sweeping through the territory. He spoke of his concerns about the mining operations, not just their encroachment on grazing land, but the environmental damage they caused. "The mines dump their tailings into the streams," he explained. "Poisons the water for miles downstream, kills the fish, makes the water unfit for cattle or crops. Surely there are regulations out here." Zeke's laugh held no humor. "The territorial government is in the pocket of men like Harrington. Mining means money, and money means influence. Is that why you refuse to sell your ranch, to stand against such practices?" Zeke was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Partly," he finally admitted. "But it's more than that. This land. It gets into your blood. My father used to say that a man needs to belong somewhere, to have a piece of earth that knows his footsteps. The Double C is that place for me." The conviction in his voice resonated with something in Grace. Since her father's death, she had felt adrift, without anchor or purpose beyond mere survival. The idea of belonging so completely to a place was both foreign and deeply appealing. As the evening wore on, Martha showed Grace to a small but comfortable bedroom. "It was Zeke's as a boy," she explained, lighting a lamp. "Now it's our guest room, though we don't get many visitors this far out." Grace noticed a small framed photograph on the bedside table, a younger Zeke in a Union Army uniform standing beside a pretty dark-haired woman. "Is that his wife, Sarah?" Martha confirmed, her expression softening. "And their baby girl, Emma. Zeke doesn't talk about them much, but he keeps that picture close." After Martha left, Grace studied the photograph more closely. The woman was lovely, with a gentle smile that reached her eyes, and she held an infant wrapped in a christening gown. Zeke stood protectively beside them, his expression a mixture of pride and tenderness that was a far cry from the guarded man she knew. The sheriff had mentioned that Zeke had lost his family, but seeing their faces made their absence more real, more painful to contemplate. She carefully replaced the photograph, feeling as though she had intruded on something deeply private. Sleep came fitfully that night, with the storm's fury providing a dramatic backdrop to her tumultuous thoughts. She found herself increasingly drawn to Zeke Calloway, not just his handsome features but his principles and the depth of feeling behind his seemingly stoic exterior. Yet she was employed by the very man who represented the greatest threat to his way of life. It was an impossible situation. Morning brought clear skies and the earthy scent of renewal that follows a heavy rain. Grace rose early, eager to return to town before her absence caused gossip. She found Zeke on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the distant mountains in hues of pink and gold. "It's beautiful," Grace said, joining him at the railing. "Worth protecting," he replied simply. Their gazes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or the recognition of a kindred spirit beneath their superficial differences. The ride back to Cherry Creek was companionable, with Zeke pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the valley's history. As they approached the outskirts of town, however, his demeanor changed, becoming more reserved. "People will talk," he said abruptly. "About you staying at my ranch overnight." "Let them," Grace replied with more confidence than she felt. "There was a storm and you offered shelter." "There's nothing improper in that. Harrington won't see it that way. He'll use it against you. Mr. Harrington is my employer, not my keeper." Grace straightened in her saddle. "I'm grateful for your hospitality, Zeke, and I won't pretend otherwise to appease town gossips." They paused at the edge of town, reluctant to part ways. Finally, Zeke said, "Be careful, Grace. Harrington doesn't take kindly to those who associate with his adversaries. I'm beginning to think Cherry Creek requires me to choose sides in a conflict I barely understand." "Sometimes neutrality isn't an option," Zeke replied grimly. "Not when the stakes are high enough." With that cryptic warning, he tipped his hat and turned his horse, leaving Grace to ride the final distance into town alone, her thoughts in turmoil. As Zeke had predicted, her return generated considerable interest. She had barely reached the livery stable when Harriet Wilson, the telegraph operator's wife and Cherry Creek's most notorious gossip, intercepted her. "Miss Fairchild, we were all so concerned when you didn't return last night. Sheriff Miller was about to organize a search party." "That would have been unnecessary, Mrs. Wilson. I was caught in the storm and took shelter at the Double C Ranch." Harriet's eyebrows shot up so far they nearly disappeared into her hairline. "At Calloway's place, alone." "The foreman and his wife were present," Grace replied coolly, dismounting and handing the reins to the stable boy. "It was all perfectly proper." Of course," Harriet said, though her expression suggested otherwise. "Still, a young woman of your standing, well, people do talk." "Then let us give them something substantive to discuss, Mrs. Wilson. Perhaps the upcoming Harvest Festival. I understand you're on the organizing committee." The deflection worked, and Harriet launched into a detailed description of the planned festivities, allowing Grace to extricate herself and return to her lodgings at the hotel to change before reporting to the Mercantile. Harrington was waiting for her when she arrived, his expression thunderous. "Miss Fairchild, my office. Now." Grace followed him up the narrow stairs to the room above the store that served as his business headquarters. Maps covered one wall with the Double C and surrounding ranches clearly marked, many with notes about mineral deposits and potential mining sites. "I understand you spent the night at Calloway's ranch," Harrington said without preamble, closing the door behind them. "I was caught in the storm, Mr. Harrington. Mr. Calloway offered shelter, as would any decent person under the circumstances." "You fail to appreciate the delicacy of your position, Miss Fairchild." Harrington's voice was controlled, but anger simmered beneath the surface. "As manager of my store, your actions reflect on my business and my standing in this community." "With all due respect, sir, how I spend my personal time, there is no personal time in a town like Cherry Creek," Harrington cut her off. "Everything is observed, noted, and remembered. By associating with Calloway, you align yourself with his opposition to progress, to the very future of this town." "I've aligned myself with no one, Mr. Harrington. I was simply caught in a storm." Harrington studied her for a long moment, his gaze calculating. "Let me be direct, Miss Fairchild. Zeke Calloway stands in the way of developments that would bring prosperity to hundreds. His stubborn refusal to sell his ranch blocks access to valuable silver deposits and impedes the railway extension that would connect Cherry Creek to markets across the nation." "And your interest in this is purely for the public good, I suppose?" Grace couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "My interests align with the town's interests," Harrington replied smoothly. "Progress benefits us all. Calloway clings to a dying way of life out of sentiment and misplaced pride. Or perhaps because he values things that can't be measured in dollars and cents." The words slipped out before Grace could censor them. Harrington's eyes narrowed. "I see he's already influenced your thinking." "That's unfortunate." He moved to the map, tracing the outline of the Double C Ranch. The silver vein that runs through Cherry Creek continues directly under Calloway's land. The richest deposits, according to our surveys, lie beneath his northern pastures. With those resources, this town could become the most prosperous in Colorado. "And you would be significantly wealthier as a result," Grace observed. "I make no apologies for being a businessman, Miss Fairchild, but this is larger than my personal fortune. It's about the future of Cherry Creek itself." Grace approached the map, studying it thoughtfully. "Have you considered a compromise? Perhaps Mr. Calloway would lease portions of his land for mining while retaining ownership of the ranch itself." Harrington laughed dismissively. You don't know him very well if you think he'd agree to that. He's refused every reasonable offer I've made. He turned to face her directly. I hired you for your intelligence and business acumen, Miss Fairchild. I would prefer to have you as an ally in this matter, but I will proceed with or without your support. What exactly are you asking of me, Mr. Harrington? Nothing unreasonable. Simply that you maintain a professional distance from Calloway and his sympathizers. Your position gives you access to information about the town's business dealings, credit arrangements, supply orders, all of which could be useful to someone looking to obstruct progress. The implication was clear. Harrington suspected she might pass information to Zeke that could be used against him. The fact that such a thought had never crossed her mind until this moment was beside the point. I have never betrayed an employer's confidence, Mr. Harrington, and I don't intend to start now, Grace said firmly. But neither will I allow you to dictate my personal associations. Harrington's expression hardened. Then we find ourselves at an impasse, Miss Fairchild. I value your contributions to the mercantile, but I cannot have an employee whose loyalties are divided. I suggest you consider your position carefully. The threat was unmistakable: choose sides or lose your job. Grace felt a surge of indignation, but practicality tempered her response. She needed this position, at least until she had saved enough to establish herself independently. I understand your concerns, Mr. Harrington. I assure you my work will continue to be exemplary, regardless of who I encounter during a thunderstorm. Harrington seemed about to argue further when the door opened, and Tommy burst in, his freckled face flushed with excitement. Mr. Harrington, sir, the telegram you've been waiting for from Denver, it just arrived. Harrington's irritation at the interruption quickly gave way to anticipation. He took the yellow paper from Tommy's hand, reading it with growing satisfaction. Excellent news, Miss Fairchild, he said, his good humor apparently restored. The territorial court has ruled in favor of the mining consortium. Water rights now officially belong to the highest economic use, which means mining takes precedence over agriculture and ranching. The implications of this news were not lost on Grace. Without guaranteed water access, ranches like the Double C would struggle to maintain their herds. This changes everything, Harrington continued, folding the telegram carefully and placing it in his vest pocket. Calloway's resistance becomes irrelevant if we control the watershed. He'll have no choice but to sell, and at my price. Surely there are legal protections for established water claims, Grace said, remembering Zeke's concern about mine tailings polluting the streams. The law favors progress, Miss Fairchild, as it should. Harrington's smile was triumphant. Now I believe we have a store to run. This discussion can wait for another time. As Grace descended the stairs, her mind raced. The ruling Harrington had mentioned would affect not just Zeke, but all the ranchers and farmers in the area. It represented a fundamental shift in how the territory's resources would be allocated, with profound implications for the region's future. She needed to warn Zeke, but doing so would confirm Harrington's suspicions about her divided loyalties. Yet how could she remain silent when livelihoods and a way of life hung in the balance? The day passed in a blur of customers and transactions, but Grace's thoughts remained fixed on her dilemma. By closing time, she had reached a decision. Whatever the consequences, she couldn't stand by while Harrington used legal maneuvering to force Zeke and others off their land. After ensuring the store was locked and the day's receipts secured, she made her way to the telegraph office. Harriet Wilson was on duty, her curiosity piqued by Grace's evening visit. "Miss Fairchild, what a surprise! How can I help you this fine evening?" "I need to send a message to the Double C Ranch," Grace said, keeping her tone casual. "A business matter regarding some special orders." Harriet's eyes gleamed with interest. "I wasn't aware the ranch had telegraph service." "I understand a rider delivers messages from town," Grace replied, having overheard this detail from one of the local ranchers. "That's right. Young Billy Jenkins makes the rounds each morning. Harriet slid a blank form across the counter. Just write your message and I'll see it's included in tomorrow's delivery. Grace hesitated, pen poised above paper. Every word would pass through Harriet's hands and inevitably into the town's gossip mill. She needed to be careful. Actually, Mrs. Wilson, I believe I'll ride out myself tomorrow. It's my day off and the exercise would be welcome. She returned the blank form with an apologetic smile. Thank you anyway. Harriet's disappointment was palpable. As you wish, Miss Fairchild, though I'd be happy to save you the trouble. Your thoughtfulness is appreciated. Grace bid her good night and stepped back into the street, relief mingling with frustration. She couldn't risk sending a written message, but waiting until tomorrow might be too late. As she pondered this problem, a familiar figure emerged from the saloon across the street. Ben Taylor, Zeke's foreman, was apparently in town for supplies or perhaps a well-deserved drink after a day's labor. Providence, Grace decided, was smiling upon her. She crossed the street quickly, catching Ben as he was untying his horse. Mr. Taylor, she called softly. Ben turned, surprise registering on his weathered face. Miss Fairchild, didn't expect to see you out and about at this hour. I need to speak with Mr. Calloway, Grace said, keeping her voice low. It's urgent regarding the territorial court ruling on water rights. Ben's expression turned serious. You've heard about that then. Mr. Harrington received confirmation today. He intends to use the ruling to force the sale of the Double C and other ranches by controlling access to water. Ben swore under his breath, then immediately apologized. Pardon my language, madam, but this isn't unexpected. Harrington's been working toward this for years. Mr. Calloway needs to know the details and soon. There may still be time to mount a legal challenge or seek alternatives. I'll ride back tonight, Ben said, already swinging into his saddle. Zeke's been in Denver lobbying against this very ruling. He returned this morning and he'll want to know immediately. Grace hesitated, then made a swift decision. Tell him I may have access to more information through the mercantile. If there's anything specific he needs to know, I'll try to help. Ben studied her intently. That's a dangerous offer, Miss Fairchild. Harrington wouldn't take kindly to such assistance. I'm aware of the risks, Mr. Taylor. Grace straightened her shoulders. But some principles are worth defending, even at personal cost. A slow smile spread across Ben's face. Zeke said you had spirit. Seems he was right. He tipped his hat. I'll deliver your message, madam, and thank you. As Ben rode off into the gathering dusk, Grace felt a curious mixture of apprehension and resolve. She had crossed a line, aligning herself with Zeke's cause in a way that could not be easily explained away as mere social courtesy. If Harrington discovered her actions, her position and reputation would be in jeopardy. Yet for the first time since her father's death, she felt she was standing for something meaningful, something larger than her own survival or advancement. The sensation was both frightening and exhilarating. The following days brought an increased tension to Cherry Creek. News of the territorial court ruling spread quickly, dividing the town even more sharply between those who saw it as progress and those who recognized it as a threat to their way of life. The ranchers and farmers who frequented the mercantile spoke in hushed, angry tones about organizing resistance, while the mine owners and their supporters celebrated openly in the saloons. Harrington was rarely at the store now, occupied with meetings in Denver and consultations with mining engineers about expanding operations onto what he clearly assumed would soon be former ranchland. His absence gave Grace freedom to quietly gather information about his plans, details about water diversion projects, proposed mining sites, and the railway extension that would cut directly through the Double C Tikes, best grazing land. She compiled these fragments carefully, waiting for an opportunity to convey them to Zeke without arousing suspicion. That chance came unexpectedly when Sheriff Miller stopped by the store with a notice to be posted. Town meeting tomorrow night at the schoolhouse, he explained, handing her the paper. All property owners invited to discuss the implications of the territorial court ruling. Harrington's idea, though I suspect it's more to announce his plans than to seek input. Will you be attending, Sheriff? Grace asked, pinning the notice to the community board near the door. Have to. Someone's got to keep the peace if things get heated. He leaned against the counter, lowering his voice. Word is Calloway's organizing the ranchers to present a united front. Could get interesting. I imagine Mr. Harrington won't appreciate opposition to his vision. The sheriff snorted. Harrington's used to getting his way, but Zeke's got support not just from the ranchers but from some of the older merchants who remember what this town was like before the mines took over. He studied Grace thoughtfully. You might want to attend yourself, Miss Fairchild. Educational, seeing how frontier democracy works. I'm not a property owner, Grace pointed out. Meetings open to all residents, the sheriff replied with a wink. Besides, as Harrington's store manager, you've got a stake in whatever comes next. After the sheriff left, Grace found herself contemplating his suggestion. The meeting would provide an opportunity to see Zeke and perhaps find a way to share what she had learned. But it would also put her squarely in the middle of the town's conflict, in full view of Harrington and his allies. The decision was made for her the next morning when Harrington returned from Denver and summoned her to his office. Miss Fairchild, I'll need you to attend the town meeting with me this evening, he said without preamble. Bring the ledgers showing outstanding accounts for the ranchers. I may need to reference them during discussions. Of course, Mr. Harrington, Grace replied, keeping her expression neutral despite her inner alarm. The ledgers would reveal the precarious financial position of many ranchers, including Zeke information Harrington could use to undermine their credibility or pressure them into selling. I'm announcing a significant expansion of our operations tonight, Harrington continued, spreading a map across his desk. The Silver Bounty Mine will extend tunnels beneath the northern section of Calloway's property, with or without his cooperation. The new water rights ruling gives us legal authority to divert Cherry Creek for our operations, which will effectively force him to the negotiating table. And if he continues to resist, Grace asked, struggling to maintain a professional demeanor, Harrington's smile was cold. Everyone has their breaking point, Miss Fairchild, even the stubborn Zeke Calloway. The schoolhouse was packed that evening, with nearly every adult resident of Cherry Creek in attendance. The single room had been arranged with a table at the front for Harrington, Mayor Jenkins, and the town council members, with rows of benches facing them. Grace sat in the second row, the ledgers on her lap, uncomfortably aware of the hostile glances directed her way from the ranchers and farmers clustered at the back of the room. Her association with Harrington clearly marked her as part of the opposition in their eyes. Zeke arrived just as the meeting was called to order, accompanied by Ben and several other ranchers. Their entrance caused a momentary hush, followed by a buzz of whispered comments. Zeke's gaze swept the room, pausing briefly when it met Grace's. His expression revealed nothing, but she thought she detected a flicker of acknowledgement before he took a position standing against the back wall, arms crossed. Mayor Jenkins, a portly former merchant who owed his position largely to Harrington's support, opened the proceedings with platitudes about progress and cooperation before yielding the floor to Harrington. Friends and neighbors, Harrington began, his voice carrying easily through the crowded room. We stand at a crossroads in the history of Cherry Creek. The territorial court's ruling on water rights represents a recognition of our community's true destiny not as a backwater ranching settlement, but as a hub of mining and commerce that will bring prosperity to all. Murmurs of both approval and dissent rippled through the audience. To that end, Harrington continued, I am pleased to announce that the Cherry Creek Mining Consortium, which I have the honor to represent, will be expanding operations significantly in the coming months. We'll be doubling the workforce at the Silver Bounty Mine, extending the tunnels to access newly identified veins, and implementing modern water diversion techniques to increase efficiency. He gestured to a large map displayed on the wall behind him, where the proposed expansions were clearly marked directly beneath the Double C Ranch. Additionally, we have received confirmation that the Denver and Rio Grande Railway will extend a spur to Cherry Creek, connecting us to markets across the nation, provided we secure the necessary right-of-way. Harrington's gaze fixed deliberately on Zeke. Some of our neighbors have been reluctant to embrace these developments. I hope tonight's discussion will help them understand that resistance to progress serves no one's interests, least of all their own. Mayor Jenkins nodded enthusiastically. Well said, Mr. Harrington. Now, before we open the floor for questions, I believe Mr. Calloway has requested time to address the assembly. A murmur of surprise ran through the crowd. Clearly, this departure from the planned agenda hadn't been anticipated by Harrington, whose smile faltered momentarily. Zeke moved to the front of the room with the unhurried confidence of a man accustomed to having space made for him. He didn't raise his voice, but its deep timbre carried authority that commanded attention. I'm not one for speeches, he began, so I'll be direct. What Mr. Harrington calls progress, I call destruction. The mining operations he proposes will poison the watershed that sustains not just my ranch but every farm and homestead for miles. The railway he wants to build would cut through lands that have supported cattle for generations. He turned to face the assembled townsfolk rather than the officials at the table. I'm not against change or even mining itself, but there are ways to extract silver that don't devastate the land, and routes for railways that don't destroy viable ranchland. What I oppose is the notion that what's old must give way to what's new, simply because there's more money in it for a few powerful men. Harrington's face had darkened with anger. Your sentimentality is misplaced, Calloway. The territorial court has spoken. Water will go to its highest economic use mining, not to sustain your outdated way of life. The court ruled without hearing from those most affected, Zeke countered. A decision bought and paid for by mining interests. An older man stood from the audience. My family's farmed outside Cherry Creek for 15 years. If they divert the water like they're planning, my fields will dry up by midsummer. Where's the progress in that? Others began to speak up, some supporting Harrington's vision of industrial growth. Others expressing concerns about environmental damage, loss of agricultural land, and the changing character of the community. The meeting quickly devolved into heated exchanges, with Mayor Jenkins struggling to maintain order. Grace observed the dynamics carefully, noting who aligned with which faction and the specific concerns raised by various citizens. Harrington, seeing his carefully orchestrated announcement turning into a public debate he hadn't anticipated, tried to regain control. Miss Fairchild, he called out suddenly, please bring those ledgers forward. Grace froze, the heavy account books suddenly seeming like a betrayal waiting to happen. If she provided Harrington with the ammunition to publicly humiliate the ranchers by exposing their debts, she would be complicit in his scheme. All eyes turned to her as she sat, unmoving, the internal struggle evident in her expression. Miss Fairchild, Harrington repeated, his tone hardening. The ledgers, if you please. Slowly, Grace rose to her feet, clutching the books to her chest. Instead of walking forward to Harrington, however, she turned to address the room. These ledgers contain the private financial information of many citizens of Cherry Creek, she said, her voice clear despite her racing heart. I don't believe it would be ethical to share such personal details in a public forum. A stunned silence fell over the assembly, Harrington's face contorted with rage. You forget yourself, Miss Fairchild. Those records belong to my business and I decide how they're used. The information belongs to your business, yes, Grace agreed. But the dignity of those represented in these pages belongs to them alone. I cannot in good conscience participate in using their financial circumstances against them in this debate. Zeke stepped forward. Miss Fairchild is right. This isn't about who owes what to whom. It's about the future of Cherry Creek and whether that future includes all of us or just those wealthy enough to buy their way into it. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd, particularly from the ranchers and small merchants. Harrington, realizing he was losing control of the narrative, changed tactics. Very well. We can set aside the financial questions for now, but the legal reality remains unchanged. The territorial court has ruled and the mining operations will proceed as planned, those who find themselves inconvenienced by progress will need to adapt or move on. Or perhaps, came a new voice from the doorway, they might consider a third option. All heads turned to see a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit enter the schoolhouse. He was accompanied by two other well-dressed gentlemen, one carrying a leather portfolio. "Mr. Harrington," the newcomer nodded coolly. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure of meeting formally, though I'm familiar with your operations. I'm James Thornton, representing the Department of the Interior." Harrington's expression shifted from anger to wariness. "What brings a federal official to our local meeting, Mr. Thornton?" "Concerns about water quality and land use primarily." Thornton moved to the front of the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "It seems the environmental impact of your proposed expansions may have been inadequately assessed." He opened the portfolio his assistant handed him. "My department has received reports of contaminated waterways, fish kills, and livestock deaths downstream from your existing operations. Before any expansion can be approved, we'll need comprehensive environmental studies and public health assessments." The revelation sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. Harrington's face had paled slightly. "Furthermore," Thornton continued, "there are questions about the legitimacy of certain mineral claims that overlap with established ranch boundaries. The federal government takes a great interest in ensuring that territorial decisions don't violate prior rights or treaties." Zeke stepped forward. "Mr. Thornton, I believe many of us would welcome federal oversight of the situation. There are larger principles at stake than merely local economic interests." Thornton nodded. "Indeed, Mr. Calloway, that's precisely why we're here." He turned back to Harrington. "My team will be conducting a thorough review of all mining operations and proposed expansions in the Cherry Creek watershed. In the meantime, I'm authorized to issue a temporary injunction against any new development until our investigation is complete." The meeting erupted into chaos at this announcement. Cheers from the ranchers and farmers, outraged protests from Harrington's supporters. Through it all, Grace stood motionless, the ledgers still clutched to her chest, her gaze locked with Zeke's across the tumult. In his eyes, she saw something unexpected, not triumph over Harrington's setback, but gratitude directed at her. Her small act of defiance had somehow mattered, had perhaps been a catalyst for larger changes now unfolding. As the meeting dissolved into smaller groups heatedly discussing this dramatic turn of events, Grace made her way toward the door, the weight of her decision settling upon her. She had effectively ended her employment at the Mercantile. Harrington would never forgive such public opposition. Outside in the cool evening air, she leaned against the schoolhouse wall, drawing deep breaths to calm her racing thoughts. The door opened and closed beside her, and she knew without looking who had followed her out. "That was a brave thing you did in there," Zeke said quietly. "Or foolish," Grace replied, finally turning to face him. "I've likely lost my position." "Probably," he agreed. "Harrington doesn't tolerate disloyalty." "It wasn't disloyalty to him that motivated me. It was loyalty to something more important, the privacy and dignity of the people represented in those ledgers, people like you." Zeke studied her face in the moonlight. "How did you know Thornton was coming?" "I didn't," Grace admitted. "Though I'd heard rumors of federal interest in the water contamination issues. Ben may have mentioned it when he visited the store last week. And those rumors somehow found their way to the Department of the Interior, along with detailed reports of Harrington's operations and their effects on the watershed." There was a hint of a smile on Zeke's face. Reports that contained information only someone with access to the mercantile's records might have. Grace didn't confirm or deny this observation. I believe in fair play, Mr. Calloway. What Harrington was planning wasn't just unfair to you and the other ranchers, it threatened the land itself and the future of everyone who depends on it. You'll be hated for this, Zeke said softly, gesturing toward the schoolhouse where Harrington's angry voice could still be heard above the general commotion. At least by some. Grace straightened, meeting his gaze directly. Then hate will have to learn to lose. For a moment, Zeke seemed taken aback by her appropriation of words he'd once spoken in a very different context. Then a genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his usually serious countenance. Grace Fairchild, he said, shaking his head in wonder, you are not at all what I expected when you stepped off that stagecoach. Nor you what I anticipated when you kept me from falling face first into the mud, she replied, returning his smile. Life is full of surprises, it seems. The schoolhouse door burst open and people began streaming out, still arguing passionately about the evening's revelations. Harrington emerged, his face set in cold fury as he scanned the crowd. When he spotted Grace with Zeke, his eyes narrowed dangerously. This isn't over, he called to them. Not by a long shot. Thornton will find everything in order and then we'll proceed as planned. His gaze fixed on Grace. And you, Miss Fairchild, have just made the gravest mistake of your life. You're dismissed from your position, effective immediately. I'll expect the ledgers returned to the store by morning. They're already there, Mr. Harrington, Grace replied calmly. On your desk, where they belong. Harrington's jaw clenched at being outmaneuvered even in this small matter. Without another word, he stalked off toward the saloon, several of his associates hurrying after him. Well, Grace said, watching him go, that's that, I appear to be unemployed. What will you do now? Zeke asked. Grace considered the question. She had saved some money during her time at the mercantile, but not enough to return east, even if she'd wanted to. And she realized with some surprise that she didn't want to. Despite the complications and conflicts, Cherry Creek had begun to feel more like home than Boston ever had. I'm not sure, she admitted. Though I've always thought the town could use a proper bookshop, perhaps with a tearoom attached. Zeke nodded thoughtfully. The old Wilson place on Cedar Street has been empty since the widow moved to Denver. It has good display windows and living quarters upstairs. Are you suggesting I open a business in direct competition with the man who now despises me? Grace asked, arching an eyebrow. I'm suggesting you do what you're clearly good at, building something worthwhile. Zeke's expression grew serious. Cherry Creek needs more people like you, Grace. People who stand for something beyond profit. The way he said her name sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the mild spring evening. Before she could respond, Martha Taylor approached, her usually stern face alight with excitement. There you are, she exclaimed, grabbing Grace's hands. You wonderful, brave girl. The way you stood up to Harrington, I could have cheered. Ben joined them, clapping Zeke on the shoulder. Thornton's timing couldn't have been better. Someone must have sent him some mighty compelling evidence to bring him all the way from Denver. Someone did, Zeke agreed, his gaze still on Grace. Someone who understands that some battles are worth fighting, even at personal cost. Martha looked between them, a knowing smile spreading across her face. Miss Fairchild, now that you're without employment or lodging, Harrington owns the hotel. After all, I insist you come stay at the ranch until you sort out your next steps. We have plenty of room and I could use the female company. That's very kind, Mrs. Taylor, but I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition, Zeke interjected. It's the least we can do, considering what you've risked on our behalf. Grace hesitated. Accepting their offer would cement her allegiance in the eyes of the town and likely make reconciliation with Harrington impossible. But looking at the three earnest faces before her, she realized she had already chosen her side in this conflict. Thank you, she said finally. I accept your hospitality, at least until I can make other arrangements. As they walked toward the tailor's wagon, parked at the edge of the schoolyard, Grace felt lighter than she had in months. She had lost her position and perhaps made a powerful enemy, but she had gained something more valuable: the knowledge that she could stand for what was right, even when it came at a cost. The days that followed brought significant changes to Cherry Creek. Thornton and his team established themselves in town, conducting interviews and inspections of the mining operations. Harrington was rarely seen, closeted with his lawyers and business associates as they prepared their defense against the federal inquiry. Grace found herself unexpectedly busy despite her unemployment. Word of her stand against Harrington spread quickly, and many of the ranchers' wives and townsfolk who had been intimidated by the merchant's influence now sought her advice on business matters and account discrepancies. She began keeping informal office hours at the tailor's home in town, helping people untangle the often confusing terms Harrington had imposed on their credit arrangements. Her plan for a bookshop gained momentum when the widow Wilson, hearing of Grace's situation, wrote from Denver offering favorable terms for the purchase of her former property. Several of the ranchers, led by Zeke, offered to invest in the venture, seeing it as both a worthwhile addition to the community and a statement against Harrington's commercial monopoly. Through it all, Grace and Zeke grew closer. He often accompanied her on rides around the valley, showing her hidden waterfalls and ancient petroglyphs left by indigenous peoples who had inhabited the area long before white settlers arrived. He spoke of his dreams for the Double C not just as a cattle operation, but as a model of sustainable ranching that worked with the land rather than exploiting it. Grace found herself drawn to his vision as much as to the man himself. There was a depth to Zeke Calloway that contradicted the straightforward cowboy image he presented to the world. He read widely, thought deeply about the changing West, and carried the losses of his past with a dignity that moved her profoundly. One evening, about a month after the fateful town meeting, they rode to a high meadow overlooking the valley. The setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and purple, the distant mountains standing sentinel against the darkening sky. "I come here sometimes to think," Zeke said as they dismounted, "to remind myself what I'm fighting for." Grace breathed in the clean mountain air, taking in the panoramic view of Cherry Creek and the surrounding ranchlands. "It's beautiful. I can see why you'd never want to leave." "I almost did after Sarah and Emma died." Zeke's voice was quiet but steady. "Couldn't bear to be here without them. Enlisted when the war broke out, hoping maybe a rebel bullet would solve my problems." Grace remained silent, sensing he needed to tell this story in his own way. "But war has a way of changing your perspective," he continued. "Saw too much death, too much destruction, made me realize that any life is precious. When I came home, the ranch was in disrepair, but it was still here, still mine. Felt like Sarah would have wanted me to rebuild, to go on living. She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. Zeke turned to face Grace directly. "And she would have liked you, your courage, your principles." Grace felt a flush rise to her cheeks at the simple compliment. "I'm not sure what I've done deserves such praise. I simply couldn't participate in something I knew was wrong." "That's exactly why it matters. Most people find it easier to look the other way." Zeke took a step closer. "You never asked why I refused to sell to Harrington, even before the water rights issue. I assumed it was because of your family's history here, your attachment to the land, partly, but there's more to it." Zeke gestured toward the western edge of his property. "There's a small cemetery on that rise where my parents are buried, and Sarah and Emma, understanding dawned on Grace. You couldn't sell because you'd be selling their resting place. Harrington knew that, offered to have them relocated to the town cemetery as part of the deal. As if they were just items to be moved at convenience." His voice held a controlled anger that spoke of old wounds. "Some things aren't for sale at any price, some principles can't be compromised no matter the cost. Like protecting the watershed, even if it means fighting the most powerful man in the territory." "Exactly." Zeke's expression softened as he looked at her. I never expected to find someone who understood that, not here, not now. The air between them seemed to change, charged with something more than the shared conviction that had brought them together. Grace was acutely aware of how close he stood, of the warmth in his blue eyes as they held her gaze. "Grace," he said, her name almost a prayer on his lips. I know it's too soon, and there are 100 reasons why I shouldn't say this, but she never learned what he had been about to say because at that moment the thunder of approaching hooves interrupted them. Ben Taylor appeared over the ridge, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Zeke." He called as soon as he was within earshot. "There's trouble at the north pasture. Someone's cut the fence and stampeded the cattle through the Thompson property. Half the herd's scattered to hell and gone." Zeke's expression immediately shifted from tender vulnerability to focused determination. "Harrington's men, has to be, too organized for random mischief." Ben glanced apologetically at Grace. "Sorry to interrupt, but we need every hand. Thompson's furious, says his wheat crop is trampled beyond saving." "We'll make it right with him," Zeke said grimly, already moving toward his horse. "Grace, Ben can take you back to the ranch. I'm coming with you," Grace interjected firmly. "I can ride as well as most, and you need every person available." Zeke looked like he might argue, then nodded sharply. "Stay close to Ben or me. This could get dangerous if Harrington's men are still around." The three of them rode hard toward the northern boundary of the Double C, where they found chaos. Cattle had broken through Thompson's fields and scattered into the foothills beyond. Several ranch hands were already attempting to round up the nearest animals, while Thompson himself stood amid the ruins of his wheat field, his face a mask of helpless rage. "Calloway," he shouted when he spotted Zeke. "Your damn cattle have destroyed everything." Zeke dismounted, approaching the farmer with his hands raised placatingly. "This wasn't an accident, Thompson. Someone cut my fences deliberately, drove the cattle this way on purpose. And I'm supposed to care about that. My entire crop is gone." Thompson gestured wildly at the trampled wheat. "That's my family's food for the winter, our cash for next year's seed. I understand." Zeke's voice remained calm despite the tension. "The Double C will compensate you fully, you have my word." Thompson's anger seemed to deflate slightly. "Your word's always been good, Calloway. But this is more than just money. This is Harrington showing us what happens when we stand against him." "All the more reason not to let him win," Grace said, dismounting to join the conversation. "If we turn against each other, he achieves exactly what he wants." Thompson looked at her with surprise, then grudging respect. "You're the store manager who stood up to him at the meeting." "Former store manager," Grace corrected. "And yes, I believe we're stronger united than divided." "Pretty words," Thompson sighed. "But they won't feed my children or replant my fields." "No," Zeke agreed, "but this will." He removed a folded document from his vest pocket. "It's a promissory note for the full value of your crop plus extra for the trouble. Take it to the bank in Denver, not Harrington's bank here, and they'll honor it immediately." Thompson examined the note, his eyebrows rising at the amount. "This is more than fair, Calloway. The extra is because I should have anticipated something like this." Harrington's not one to take defeat graciously. With Thompson temporarily pacified, they turned to the more immediate problem of recovering the scattered herd. Grace proved herself surprisingly capable, following Ben's instructions and helping to drive the cattle back toward the Double Ceticus corrals. The work was exhausting and continued well after nightfall, with lanterns providing limited illumination as they searched for strays in the foothills. By dawn, most of the herd had been recovered, though Zeke estimated they were still missing at least 30 head. As they rode back to the ranch, tired and saddle-sore but satisfied with what they had accomplished, Grace found herself riding beside Zeke. "You're a natural on horseback," he commented. "Not many Eastern ladies would have managed what you did tonight." "Not many Eastern ladies have had the opportunity to try," Grace replied, stretching her aching shoulders. "There's something liberating about this work, difficult, yes, but meaningful." That's the paradox of ranching, hardest job you'll ever love. He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. You surprise me, Grace Fairchild. Every time I think I have your measure, you reveal another facet. Is that a good thing? She asked, suddenly uncertain, the best kind of thing. His smile was tired but genuine. A person ought to have depths that take a lifetime to explore. The implication of his words, a lifetime together, hung in the air between them, neither acknowledged nor denied. As the sun rose over the eastern plains, casting long shadows across the rolling landscape, Grace felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced before, not even in the home where she was born. The retaliation against the Double C was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, a series of incidents targeted those who had opposed Harrington at the town meeting. The smithy who had spoken out found his forge mysteriously damaged. The general store that had offered Grace temporary employment had its windows broken. Even Sheriff Miller faced pressure when the town council, dominated by Harrington's allies, threatened to reduce his budget. Throughout it all, the federal investigation continued, methodically documenting the environmental damage caused by the mining operations and interviewing anyone willing to speak about Harrington's business practices. Thornton, the Interior Department representative, maintained a professional detachment, but it was clear his findings would not favor the mining interests. Harrington, meanwhile, had shifted tactics. Instead of direct confrontation, he began a whisper campaign against Zeke, and by association, Grace. Rumors circulated that they were engaged in an improper relationship, that Grace had stolen confidential documents from the mercantile, that Zeke was secretly in league with cattle rustlers from across the territorial border. Most townsfolk recognized these allegations for what they were desperate attempts to discredit those who stood in Harrington's way. But the constant pressure took its toll, particularly on Grace, who was still establishing herself in the community. The Wilson property on Cedar Street had been secured, and renovations were underway to transform it into the bookshop and tearoom Grace had envisioned. Despite the difficulties, there was considerable support for the venture, with many citizens eager for an alternative to Harrington's commercial dominance. Grace divided her time between supervising the renovations and helping at the Double C, where she had continued to stay in the guest room. Martha Taylor had taken her under wing, teaching her the practical skills of ranch life while becoming a confidante and friend. It was Martha who first broached the subject that had been dancing around the edges of conversations for weeks. "He's in love with you, you know," she said matter-of-factly one afternoon as they preserved summer fruits in the ranch kitchen. Grace nearly dropped the jar she was sealing. "I beg your pardon, Zeke. He's in love with you. Has been since that night you stood up to Harrington at the town meeting, probably before, if truth be told. Martha, that's the honest truth, and you know it as well as I do." Martha continued wiping jars without looking up. "Question is, what do you intend to do about it?" Grace set down her work, considering her response carefully. "Zeke has never spoken of such feelings to me. Of course he hasn't. Man lost his wife and child, then spent years fighting a war that nearly broke his spirit. He's not one to risk his heart lightly." Martha finally met Grace's gaze directly. "But he looks at you the way he used to look at Sarah, like you're the answer to a question he's been asking his whole life." Heat rose to Grace's cheeks. "Even if what you say is true, the timing is impossible. With everything happening in Cherry Creek, there's never a perfect time for love, child. Life doesn't arrange itself neatly for our convenience." Martha's expression softened. "I've watched you these past weeks. The way you've taken to ranch life, the care you show for the land and the people who depend on it. You belong here not just in Cherry Creek, but at the Double C, with Zeke." Before Grace could respond, the kitchen door opened and Ben entered, his expression grave. "There's a rider coming from town," he announced. "It's Sheriff Miller, and he's in a hurry." They moved to the porch where Zeke was already waiting, watching the approaching figure with concern. Sheriff Miller reined in his horse, dust billowing around him as he dismounted. "Zeke," he greeted grimly. "There's trouble. Thornton's been called back to Denver suddenly. Word is Harrington pulled strings with the territorial governor to have the investigation suspended." "He can't do that," Grace protested. "The Department of the Interior answers to federal authority, not territorial." "Technically true," the sheriff agreed. "But Thornton's been ordered to present his findings to a review committee before any action can be taken. Harrington's bought himself time and he's using it. He's called in construction crews from Denver to begin work on the water diversion project immediately without waiting for permits or approvals." Zeke's jaw tightened. "Where are they setting up?" "Crawford's Pass, where Cherry Creek narrows. Perfect spot for a dam." "That's federal land," Ben interjected. "He can't just build there without permission." "He's claiming an old mining claim gives him rights to the site. By the time the legalities are sorted out, the dam will be built and the creek diverted right past your ranch, Zeke." The implications were clear. Without access to the creek, the double Ceticus cattle would have no water source for the lower pastures, rendering a significant portion of the ranch unusable. "When do they start?" Zeke asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Equipment's already moving in." "They plan to break ground tomorrow at dawn." Zeke nodded slowly, his decision visibly forming. "Ben, ride to the Thompson place, then to Edwards Farm. Get word to all the ranchers and farmers who depend on that creek. Tell them what's happening and ask them to meet at Crawford's Pass at sunrise." "What are you planning, Zeke?" the sheriff asked warily. "Nothing illegal, Howard, just a peaceful demonstration. Citizens concerned about their water rights gathering to observe construction and ensure all laws are being followed." The sheriff didn't look convinced. "Harrington will have hired guns there. He's expecting resistance. Then he won't be disappointed." Zeke's expression was resolute. "But we'll be armed with the law, not violence." Grace's documentation of the environmental impact, combined with our water rights claims, gives us legal standing to protest the construction. "I'm coming with you," Grace said firmly. Zeke turned to her, his eyes reflecting a complex mixture of emotions: concern, admiration, and something deeper. "This could get dangerous. All the more reason you'll need everyone who understands what's at stake." She met his gaze steadily. "Besides, I've helped document the evidence. I should be there to explain it if necessary." For a moment it seemed Zeke might argue further, but then he nodded, a reluctant smile touching his lips. "There's no talking you out of this, is there?" "None whatsoever," Grace confirmed. "Then we'd best prepare. It's going to be a long night." The preparations were methodical and thorough. Zeke met with the ranch hands, explaining the situation and asking for volunteers to join them at the pass. Every man stepped forward without hesitation, their loyalty to the Double C and its owner evident in their immediate response. Grace worked with Martha to prepare food for what might be an extended confrontation, while Ben rode out to spread the word to neighboring ranches and farms. The sheriff returned to town, promising to be present at the pass in his official capacity to keep the peace. As night fell, Zeke found Grace on the porch staring out at the distant mountains where Crawford's Pass cut a notch in the silhouette. "Second thoughts?" he asked quietly, joining her at the railing. "Not about tomorrow," she replied. "But I can't help wondering if there wasn't a better way to resolve this conflict. So much animosity, so much potential for violence, all because men like Harrington see the land only as a resource to be exploited rather than a trust to be protected." "It's the story of the West in microcosm," Zeke said. "The same pattern repeats everywhere newcomers arrive, see opportunity, and reshape the landscape with little thought for those who were here before or what might be lost in the process. Yet you're not against progress itself. Just the way it's being pursued. There's a difference between progress and mere profit. True progress considers the welfare of all, not just the bank accounts of a few." He turned to face her fully. "That's what I've been fighting for all these years, not just to preserve the Double C, but to ensure that whatever Cherry Creek becomes, It remains a place where ordinary people can build good lives, where the land is respected, not just used up and discarded. It's a noble cause, Grace said softly, one worth defending, even at the risk of being hated by those who see only obstacle where we see principle. There was a wry humor in his tone that referenced their earlier conversation. Especially then, she replied, smiling. After all, hate will have to learn to lose eventually. Zeke's expression grew serious. Grace, there's something I need to say in case tomorrow doesn't go as planned. Her heart quickened at his tone. What is it? These past weeks, having you here, it's changed everything. Reminded me there's more to life than just surviving, than just fighting the next battle. He took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. I never thought I'd feel this way again after Sarah died. Never wanted to. The risk of that kind of loss seemed too great. Grace remained silent, hardly daring to breathe as he continued. But sometimes life gives you a second chance you never asked for. Bring someone into your world who makes you realize that courage isn't just about standing against enemies. Sometimes it's about opening your heart again, despite knowing how badly it can hurt. He took her hands in his touch gentle but sure. I love you, Grace Fairchild. I think I have since that first day in the mud. And whatever happens tomorrow or the days after, I needed you to know that. The simple declaration, spoken without flourish or artifice, moved Grace more deeply than any elaborate profession could have. In Zeke's eyes, she saw not just affection but a profound respect and understanding that resonated with her own feelings. I love you too, she replied, the words coming easily, naturally. Though I never expected to find love in Cherry Creek, Colorado, of all places. Zeke's smile was radiant as he drew her closer. Life's full of surprises. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home, a sensation Grace had sought but never truly found until this moment, on a ranch porch under a canopy of stars, with the man who had taught her that some principles were worth any sacrifice. Dawn broke clear and cold over Crawford's Pass, where Cherry Creek narrowed between two rocky outcroppings before spreading into the valley below. By first light, a sizable group had gathered ranchers and farmers from throughout the area, each with a stake in the water that flowed through this crucial passage. They arrived to find construction equipment already in place, steam-powered excavators, wagons loaded with timber and stone, and dozens of workers preparing to begin the dam project. Harrington himself was present, directing operations with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. When he spotted the approaching riders led by Zeke and Grace, his expression darkened. He conferred briefly with a foreman before striding to meet them, flanked by several men whose hands rested conspicuously near holstered weapons. Calloway, Harrington called out as they drew closer. This is private property. You and your friends are trespassing. Zeke dismounted calmly, helping Grace down beside him. That's a matter of dispute, Harrington. This land falls under federal jurisdiction, and your mining claim doesn't grant construction rights for a dam. I have all the necessary permissions, Harrington replied dismissively. Now take your people and leave before this becomes unpleasant. Sheriff Miller rode forward, positioning himself between the two groups. As the law in Cherry Creek, I'd like to see those permissions, Mr. Harrington. This is outside your jurisdiction, Sheriff. Not when it affects the peace and welfare of my town, it isn't. Miller remained impassive. The federal injunction against new development hasn't been lifted, regardless of Mr. Thornton's temporary recall to Denver. The injunction applied to mining operations, not water management projects, Harrington countered. My lawyers have been quite clear on that distinction. Grace stepped forward, a document case in her hands. We have evidence that this project would cause irreparable harm to the watershed and violate established water rights dating back to the original settlement of this valley. Evidence collected illegally by a former employee who betrayed her position of trust. Harrington's gaze, when it fell on Grace, was venomous. You'll find yourself facing criminal charges when this is done, Miss Fairchild. The only criminal activity here is your attempt to circumvent federal law and territorial water rights," Zeke interjected, moving protectively closer to Grace. "We're prepared to present our case to the territorial court and, if necessary, to federal authorities. While you pursue your legal options, which could take months or years, my dam will be built and the water will flow where I direct it." Harrington's smile was cold. "Progress doesn't wait for outdated sentimentality, Calloway." The confrontation might have escalated further, but at that moment, a new group of riders appeared on the ridge above the pass. They weren't ranchers or farmers, but men in formal attire, led by a familiar figure, James Thornton of the Department of the Interior. "It appears I've returned just in time," Thornton remarked as he rode down to join them. "Mr. Harrington, I'm surprised to find you proceeding with construction when you were explicitly informed that all development projects affecting the watershed were suspended pending our investigation." Harrington's confidence faltered slightly. "I was told you had been recalled to Denver." "Temporarily, yes, to present my preliminary findings to the Secretary of the Interior himself." Thornton dismounted, handing a sealed document to the sheriff. "This is a federal injunction halting all construction in the Cherry Creek watershed, effective immediately and enforceable by territorial and federal authorities." The sheriff broke the seal and read the document carefully before looking up. "It's in order, Mr. Harrington. All construction must cease until the environmental impact assessment is complete." "This is outrageous," Harrington sputtered. "The territorial governor has been made aware of certain irregularities in how mining permits and water rights have been allocated in this region," Thornton interrupted smoothly. "He sends his regrets, but feels it prudent to allow federal authorities to complete their investigation before any further development proceeds." The implication was clear. Harrington's political influence had its limits, particularly when federal interests and possible corruption were involved. For a moment, it seemed Harrington might defy the injunction. His face contorted with rage as he looked from Thornton to the sheriff to Zeke and Grace. Then, with visible effort, he mastered himself. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You've won a temporary reprieve, nothing more. There are other ways to acquire what I want." "Perhaps," Zeke acknowledged, "but they'll have to be legal ones that respect the rights of everyone affected." Harrington gave orders for his workers to stand down, and the tension in the pass gradually dissipated as people realized that violence had been averted. The ranchers and farmers gathered around Thornton, eager to share their experiences and concerns about the mining operation's impact on their livelihoods. Grace found herself standing slightly apart, watching as Zeke conferred with the sheriff and Thornton. There was an ease to his bearing now, a sense that although this battle was won, he remained vigilant for the war that might still come. Martha appeared beside her, offering a cup of coffee from a thermos she had packed. "Quite a morning," she commented. "Not how I expected things to play out." "Nor I," Grace admitted. "I thought we were in for a much uglier confrontation." "Don't underestimate Harrington," Martha cautioned. "Men like that don't accept defeat graciously. He'll find another approach. We'll be ready when he does." Grace watched as Zeke noticed her gaze and smiled across the distance between them. "Together." Martha followed her line of sight and nodded approvingly. "He told you then?" "Last night." Grace couldn't keep the happiness from her voice. "About time," Martha sniffed, though her eyes twinkled. "Been watching you two circle each other for weeks like cautious dance partners." The crowd began to disperse as Thornton assured everyone that the federal investigation would be thorough and transparent. Harrington and his men departed without further confrontation, though the merchant's parting glare at Zeke and Grace promised future retribution. As they prepared to return to the Double C, Zeke drew Grace aside. "Thornton wants to speak with you privately about the documentation you provided. It's apparently been instrumental in building the federal case against Harrington's operations." Grace nodded. "I'll speak with him, of course. There's something else." Zeke glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. Harrington's lost a significant investment today. The equipment, the hired labor, the legal fees, it's a substantial financial blow. You think he might be vulnerable, potentially. Thornton mentioned that several of Harrington's Eastern investors have grown nervous about the legal complications and environmental concerns. They're considering withdrawing their support, which would leave him overextended and possibly unable to maintain his hold on Cherry Creek's businesses, Grace concluded, her quick mind grasping the implications. Exactly. Zeke's expression was thoughtful. It might create an opportunity for the town to reclaim some independence from his influence. Through new businesses like my bookshop, you mean? And perhaps more. Zeke took her hands in his. Grace, I've been thinking about what comes next after this conflict with Harrington is resolved one way or another. The seriousness in his tone made her heart quicken. And what have you concluded? That whatever happens, I want to face it with you by my side not just as an ally in this fight, but as my partner in everything that follows. His blue eyes held hers with an intensity that took her breath away. I'm asking if you'll consider a future at the Double C, with me. Though they had confessed their love the night before, this was different, a practical proposition about shared lives and intertwined futures. Grace considered all that had transpired since her arrival in Cherry Creek, how completely her life had changed in just a few short months. Zeke Calloway, she said finally, a smile spreading across her face, are you proposing marriage or a business partnership? His answering grin was part relief, part joy. Both, I suppose. I'm not much good at traditional courtship, but I know what I want, and that's you, your intelligence, your courage, your unwavering moral compass. Everything about you. Even my stubbornness and tendency to involve myself in local controversies, especially those. He drew her closer. So, Miss Fairchild, what do you say? Will you take a chance on a hard-headed rancher and the uncertain future of Cherry Creek? Grace's answer was to rise on tiptoe and press her lips to his, unconcerned with the approving murmurs and scattered applause from the remaining ranchers and farmers who witnessed their embrace. When they parted, she said simply, yes, to both the marriage and the partnership. Though I insist on keeping the bookshop as well. I wouldn't have it any other way, Zeke assured her. Cherry Creek needs more than one vision for its future. Between the ranch and your shop, we'll offer an alternative to Harrington's mining empire. A future that honors the past while embracing change, Grace agreed. One that respects the land and the people who call this valley home. They rode back to the Double C side by side, the morning sun casting long shadows behind them as it rose over the mountains. The battle for Cherry Creek's future was far from over, but for the first time, Grace felt certain that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their love a foundation as solid as the land they had both come to cherish. The wedding took place that autumn, after the cattle had been driven to market, and the first frost had painted the aspen groves gold against the evergreen backdrop of the mountains. It was a simple ceremony held at the Double C, with Martha presiding over preparations that transformed the ranch yard into a celebration of not just the union between Grace and Zeke, but the community that had come together to protect their shared vision for Cherry Creek. Harrington did not attend, of course. In the months following the confrontation at Crawford's Pass, his influence had diminished considerably. The federal investigation had resulted in substantial fines for environmental violations and the revocation of several mining permits. More significantly, his Eastern investors had withdrawn their support, forcing him to sell controlling interest in the bank and several mines to a Denver-based consortium with a more moderate approach to development. The mercantile, however, remained in his hands, though it faced unexpected competition from Grace's bookshop and Taroom, which had quickly become the social heart of Cherry Creek. The elegant establishment, with its carefully curated selection of books, periodicals, and maps, along with the finest teas and coffees available west of Denver, attracted customers from throughout the territory. Grace had insisted on keeping the shop even after her marriage, dividing her time between town and ranch in a compromise that suited both her independent nature and her commitment to their shared endeavors. The Double C prospered under their joint management, with Grace's business acumen complementing Zeke's practical knowledge of cattle and land. As winter settled over the valley, bringing shorter days and long, firelit evenings, they found themselves establishing new traditions and rhythms for their life together. The ranch house, once sparse and utilitarian, took on a warmth that reflected Grace's influence: more books on the shelves, curtains at the windows, and fresh flowers whenever the season allowed. Yet it was the deeper changes that mattered most: the way they built their partnership on mutual respect and shared purpose, each bringing different strengths to the challenges they faced together. One snowy evening, as they sat before the fire in the main room, Zeke watching Grace as she read aloud from Thoreau's Walden, he was struck by how completely she had transformed his life. The ranch, once merely a responsibility and a link to his past, had become a home again, filled with possibility and hope for the future. "What is it?" Grace asked, noticing his thoughtful gaze. "You're staring." "Just thinking how lucky I am," he replied, reaching for her hand. "How empty this place was before you arrived in Cherry Creek." She set the book aside, moving to join him on the sofa. "We're both fortunate. Not everyone finds a second chance at happiness, or a partner who shares their deepest convictions." He drew her closer, savoring the simple comfort of her presence. "Do you ever regret it? Leaving Boston, ending up in a frontier town in the middle of a local war?" "Not for a moment," Grace assured him. "Though I admit, when I stepped off that stagecoach, I never imagined I'd become a rancher's wife and a bookshop proprietor embroiled in territorial politics. Life takes unexpected turns, the best kind." She settled against his shoulder, watching the fire dance in the hearth. "Have you given any more thought to Sheriff Miller's suggestion?" The sheriff had approached Zeke several weeks earlier about running for the territorial legislature in the upcoming election. With Harrington's influence waning, there was an opportunity to ensure that Cherry Creek and similar communities had representation that understood the complex balance between development and preservation. "I have," Zeke admitted, "though I'm not sure I have the temperament for politics." "You have the conviction and the respect of people whose lives are affected by these decisions. That counts for more than political smoothness." Grace sat up to look at him directly. "Besides, you wouldn't be alone. I happen to be quite adept at navigating social complexities." Zeke laughed. "Are you offering to be my campaign manager, Mrs. Calloway? Partner in all things, remember?" She grinned. "Though I expect the Territorial Assembly might find itself dealing with a rather opinionated bookshop owner on certain issues, whether you run or not." "I don't doubt it for a moment." Zeke's expression grew serious. "If we do this, if I run, it would mean time away from the ranch from you. Are we ready for that? We'll manage as we've managed everything else. The Double C won't suffer in your absence, not with Ben and Martha here, and me dividing my time between town and ranch." She squeezed his hand. "Besides, some battles need to be fought in Denver as well as Cherry Creek." The conviction in her voice reminded Zeke of that pivotal moment months earlier when she had stood against Harrington in the schoolhouse meeting. "You'll be hated for this," he had warned her then, concerned for the consequences she would face. "Then hate will have to learn to lose," she had replied, with a certainty that had captured his heart as surely as her courage had won his admiration. Looking at her now, firelight illuminating her determined expression, Zeke knew they would continue to face opposition, criticism, and challenges in their quest to shape Cherry Creek's future. But together, they formed a formidable alliance, one built on shared principles and deepening love. "All right," he decided. "I'll speak with Miller about the election, but on one condition." "And what might that be?" "That no matter what battles we take on, we remember what we're fighting for, not just abstract principles, but this." He gestured around them at the home they were building together. "Us." Grace's smile was radiant as she leaned in to seal their agreement with a kiss. "Always," she promised. "In every battle, in every victory or setback, what matters most is that we face it together." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the double sea in pristine white. While inside, before the crackling fire, Grace and Zeke Calloway planned their future not just for themselves but for Cherry Creek and the land they had both come to love. Their story, which had begun with a chance encounter on a muddy street, had evolved into something neither could have anticipated but both now cherished beyond measure. As the years passed, their vision for Cherry Creek gradually took shape. The town grew, but in a measured way that preserved its character while embracing necessary changes. The railway eventually came, though its route was modified to minimize impact on established ranches. Mining continued, but under regulations that protected the watershed and required responsible management of waste. Zeke served 2 terms in the territorial legislature, becoming known as an effective advocate for balanced development policies that respected both economic needs and environmental concerns. Grace's bookshop expanded to include a small publishing operation that produced pamphlets and books about Western life, agricultural techniques, and local history, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The Double C prospered, becoming a model for sustainable ranching practices that others in the region began to emulate. And at the heart of it all remained Zeke and Grace's partnership, a union of complementary strengths that enabled them to achieve together what neither could have accomplished alone. When their first child was born, a son they named Thomas, after Grace's father, he entered a world very different from the one Grace had found upon her arrival in Cherry Creek. The bitter divisions had not disappeared entirely, but they had softened, replaced by a community-wide recognition that the future belonged to those willing to adapt while honoring the best of the past. Victor Harrington eventually left Cherry Creek, selling his remaining interests and moving to San Francisco to pursue new ventures. Before his departure, he paid an unexpected visit to the Double C, where Zeke met him on the porch with cautious civility. "I underestimated you, Calloway," Harrington admitted, declining the offer of coffee or more comfortable seating. "And your wife as well. You've built something here that I failed to recognize as valuable." "There are different measures of value," Zeke replied simply. "Different visions of progress, so it seems." Harrington glanced around at the thriving ranch. "Cherry Creek has chosen its path, and it's clearly not the one I envisioned. I know when to cut my losses." The meeting was brief, but it represented a kind of closure and acknowledgement that the battle for Cherry Creek's future had been decisively won by those who advocated for balance rather than exploitation. As their family grew to include a daughter, Sarah, named for Zeke's first wife in a gesture that honored rather than diminished the past, Grace sometimes reflected on the strange turns of fate that had brought her to this life. The Boston society that had once seemed her entire world now felt distant and constraining in retrospect, while the open spaces and honest relationships of her adopted home had become essential to her identity. On the 10th anniversary of her arrival in Cherry Creek, Grace stood with Zeke on the same high meadow where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. The view remained spectacular, though the town below had grown, and the Double C now included additional acreage that had once belonged to neighboring ranches whose owners had retired or moved on. "Any regrets?" Zeke asked, his arm around her waist as they surveyed the valley they had helped to shape. "Not one," Grace replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though I do sometimes wonder what might have happened if I hadn't chosen to stand against Harrington that night. If I'd simply handed over those ledgers as instructed, you couldn't have done otherwise. It's not in your nature to comply with injustice, even when it would be easier." "Perhaps not." She turned to face him, studying the face that had become so beloved, a bit more lined now, with silver threading the hair at his temples, but still handsome, still steadfast. But I'm grateful every day that you were there when I took my stand, that you understood why I had to do it." "We recognized something in each other from the beginning," Zeke observed. "A shared understanding that some principles are worth defending, no matter the cost." Grace nodded, remembering his words from so long ago. "You'll be hated for this," he had warned, concerned for her welfare even then. "Then hate will have to learn to lose," she had replied, not yet understanding how that moment would shape her entire future. And lose it had. The animosity that had once divided Cherry Creek had given way to a community that valued its diverse elements: the ranches and farms, the mines and businesses, the old settlers and newcomers, all contributing to a shared prosperity that vindicated the stand they had taken. As they rode back to the ranch, where their children waited with Martha and Ben, now honorary grandparents to the young Calloways, Grace felt a profound contentment. The path hadn't been easy, and there had been setbacks along the way, but the life they had built together was rich with purpose and love. Cherry Creek had taught her that true progress wasn't measured in buildings erected or fortunes amassed, but in communities strengthened and values upheld. And Zeke had shown her that second chances were possible, that loss and grief could give way to new joy if one had the courage to open one's heart again. Together, they had proven that principles backed by unwavering conviction could indeed triumph over hatred and greed. It was a legacy they would pass on to their children, along with the land they had fought so hard to protect, not as a possession to be exploited, but as a trust to be honored and preserved for generations yet to come. In the end, that was the true victory: not just winning a battle against a powerful adversary, but creating something enduring and meaningful from the challenge they had faced together. The story of Cherry Creek, Colorado, and of Zeke and Grace Calloway would continue long after they were gone, a testament to what could be achieved when love and principle stood firm against the forces that would diminish them. And in that endurance lay their greatest triumph. Hate had indeed learned to lose.